The throne room stood silent, its velvet drapes drawn against the fading afternoon light. But inside the walls of Buckingham Palace a storm was brewing. Not the kind that rattles windows and tears at rooftops, but one that tears at hearts, identities, and centuries of tradition. It was the kind of storm that left even kings broken. And it is here, in this moment of devastating stillness, that King Charles faced the unthinkable. The news that he had only 2 weeks left to remain on the throne he had waited his entire life to claim. 2 weeks to say goodbye. 2 weeks to watch his crown slip into the hands of another, not because of fate, nor because of death, but because of betrayal. A betrayal orchestrated not by enemies outside, but by the very people who should have been his closest allies, his son William and his wife Camilla. This is not the farewell of a man stepping down with grace or dignity. This is the quiet undoing of a reign before it has even had the chance to truly begin. But how does a man who spent more than 70 years preparing for the crown find himself forced to abdicate it? How does a king, once celebrated for finally inheriting the legacy of his mother, end up being pressured into exile by his own blood? That is the story we unravel today, a story drenched in secrecy, family politics, ambition, and tears. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. From the moment Queen Elizabeth II passed, the nation was forced to reckon with change. Charles, at long last, became king, a title that had hovered in the distance for decades, like a promise too long delayed. Yet behind the pomp and ceremony, there were whispers, sharp and insistent, about whether he was fit to rule. Critics called him too old, too fragile, too controversial, and above all, too much a relic of a fading era. Still, he pressed forward, believing this was his moment, his purpose fulfilled at last. But as the days passed, those whispers turned into conversations, and conversations into plans, until what began as speculation became a secret operation. The outcome was devastating. An ultimatum handed to Charles by the very people closest to him. The beginning of this story is not simply about Charles as a monarch, but as a man. Imagine waiting longer than anyone in history for the role you were born to inherit, only to find that once it is in your grasp, it begins to slip away. His reign was never allowed to breathe, never given time to grow roots. Instead, the crown became a burden, a weight he carried while those around him quietly plotted its removal. Behind palace walls, Camilla's influence was said to have grown stronger. To the public, she was the queen consort, standing faithfully by Charles's side. But insiders whisper a different story, one of strategy, ambition, and whispered agreements with William. For William, the calculation was clear. The monarchy, fragile in its transition, needed the vigor of youth, the stability of a future king unblemished by decades of scandal and public doubt. For Camilla, the motivations may have been more personal, tied to her own survival within the royal machine. Together, they formed a pact, whether spoken or silently understood, that the time had come to move Charles aside. It was not a sword or a revolution that forced Charles to the edge, but a conversation. A simple, devastating conversation where he was told his time was over. To the outside world, he would make it appear voluntary. To the cameras, he would smile and frame it as his own decision, a gesture of love for country and family. But in the hidden corners of the palace, the truth was brutal. He had been pushed. Pushed not by enemies, but by those he loved most. Picture him that evening, alone in his private study. The crown polished, the papers on his desk stacked neatly, the walls lined with reminders of his mother's reign. A man who had always longed for purpose, now stripped of it. Reports say he wept, not quietly, but with the kind of sorrow that shakes the body. He confided to aides that it felt as if the ground had been ripped from beneath him. "I have waited my whole life," he whispered, "and now I am told it was for nothing." The middle of this story is where the tragedy deepens. The public, unaware of the betrayal behind closed doors, still sensed something was wrong. The king's health became a constant subject of speculation, his public appearances scrutinized for signs of weakness. When rumors of abdication began to spread, many brushed them off as tabloid invention. After all, hadn't he only just begun? But the truth was darker, more painful. Within those gilded palace rooms, the countdown had already begun. 2 weeks, 14 days to unravel a life's ambition. Meanwhile, William and Camilla pressed forward with their narrative. They told themselves, and perhaps even Charles, that this was for the good of the monarchy, that the institution could not withstand another decade of uncertainty, scandal, and dwindling approval. They painted the abdication as a noble act, one that would secure the crown for future generations. But beneath the surface of duty and logic lay the raw human cost. A father cast aside by his son, a husband betrayed by his wife. The emotional weight of those 2 weeks cannot be overstated. Each day became a farewell in disguise. Each handshake, each royal engagement, carried the hidden knowledge that it would be one of the last. And as the reality set in, Charles began to understand that his farewell would not be remembered as triumphant, but as tragic. He would not be the king who redefined the monarchy, but the one who was quietly removed, the one whose reign was cut short by forces within his own family. The end of this introduction must leave us standing at the edge of the abyss, feeling the weight of betrayal pressing down. Picture the king, preparing his farewell speech. He rehearses words that sound noble, but feel hollow. He knows the cameras will capture only the surface, the trembling lip, the tearful eyes, the carefully chosen words about duty and family. But beneath it all lies the raw truth. This is not voluntary. This is not dignity. This is the painful exile of a man who waited too long, only to be cast aside too soon. And so, as we move forward in this story, we must ask, was this truly for the good of the monarchy, or was it the most ruthless betrayal in royal history? Did William and Camilla act out of duty or out of ambition? And how will history judge a king who wept in private as he was forced to say goodbye to the crown? Chapter 1 begins with a man born into destiny, yet trapped by it for more than 7 decades. Charles Philip Arthur George came into the world not as an ordinary child, but as the heir apparent, a boy whose entire identity was sculpted before he could even form words. From his earliest years, the weight of the monarchy pressed down on him, shaping his choices, his education, his friendships, even his very personality. Imagine growing up knowing that one day you would be king, but having no say in when, how, or under what circumstances that day might arrive. For Charles, life became a long corridor of waiting, filled with doors that opened briefly before slamming shut again. It was not just the public that saw him as a perpetual prince, but the world itself seemed reluctant to allow him the throne. His destiny was always just beyond his reach, dangling like a crown suspended above his head, but never settling in place. The length of that wait became a defining part of his story. No heir in British history waited longer to inherit the throne. He watched as his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, reigned decade after decade, admired for her steadiness and adored as a symbol of continuity. The longer she lived, the more Charles seemed to fade into the shadows. He was often dismissed as eccentric, overly sensitive, or out of touch, with some even speculating whether the monarchy might bypass him entirely in favor of the younger, more popular Prince William. Yet Charles endured. He carved out causes for himself, championing the environment before it was fashionable, speaking about architecture and farming in ways that sometimes sparked ridicule, but later proved visionary. Still, none of it erased the whispers. Was he ever truly fit to be king? As the years dragged on, Charles's identity as the eternal heir took on a tragic quality. Each decade seemed to reinforce the idea that his destiny would always be postponed, and with every postponement, he grew older, more fragile, more weary. The nation grew accustomed to him not as king, but as someone permanently waiting in the wings. By the time Elizabeth's reign reached its 70th year, Charles was already past 70 himself, a man who had lived a full life, yet still had not stepped into the role for which he had been prepared since birth. The irony was suffocating. The moment he had been promised since infancy arrived at an age when most men have long since retired. When the Queen finally passed, the world turned its eyes to Charles. There was grief, yes, but also an undercurrent of curiosity. How would this man, who had waited so long, finally carry the mantle of kingship? The coronation was both triumph and tragedy, a ceremony that was meant to signal renewal but also underscored just how belated his reign truly was. In interviews and public appearances, Charles tried to appear resolute, but there was a visible fragility in his demeanor. He was not the vigorous young monarch his mother had once been. He was an older man stepping into the twilight of duty. Yet in his heart, this was still his moment, the culmination of everything he had endured. He believed he had finally reached the summit. But the summit proved unstable. Almost immediately, cracks began to show. His reign was burdened by relentless comparisons to his mother, a woman whose reign had spanned the rise and fall of empires, wars, and cultural revolutions. How could Charles compete with that? Critics noted his hesitations, his quieter demeanor, his lack of commanding presence. For a monarchy struggling to remain relevant in a modern world, Charles did not feel like the answer. Instead, attention began to drift toward William and Catherine, the faces of the younger generation, energetic and seemingly ready to lead. For Charles, this was an echo of his lifelong nightmare: to be overshadowed, to be seen as a placeholder rather than a sovereign. The irony of his life's journey deepened with each passing month of his reign. After 70 years of anticipation, Charles found himself hemmed in by doubts and limitations. The very thing he had waited for now seemed poisoned. He was expected to symbolize continuity, yet at the same time, there were whispers about how long he could truly last. His age, his health, his lack of popularity, all of these factors combined to paint a picture of a king whose time might be short, even if not by choice. And while he carried on with his royal duties, beneath the surface, there lingered a terrible question. Had his entire life of waiting been for nothing? What made this struggle more painful was the sense of futility. For Charles, kingship was never about personal glory. It was about fulfilling a role, carrying a legacy, honoring his mother's memory. But what happens when the role you've waited a lifetime to play is quietly taken from you almost as soon as it begins? That is the deeper tragedy of Charles's story. The lifetime of preparation that yielded so little time and power. His reign, brief and troubled, is not remembered for sweeping changes or great victories, but for the whispers that it was never meant to last. This first chapter sets the stage for the heartbreak to come. Charles's entire life was a prelude to kingship, a 70-year prologue to a reign that would be undone not by natural causes, but by human hands. The long wait, the sacrifices, the personal struggles, all of it made the moment he was forced aside even more devastating. A man who had defined himself by his patience was betrayed just as his patience was finally rewarded. It was as though history itself mocked him, delivering a crown only to snatch it away almost immediately. But beyond the personal heartbreak, Charles's story raises larger questions. Was his reign doomed from the start because of how long he had to wait? Did the decades of delay erode the monarchy's ability to see him as a strong leader? Or was it the machinations of those around him, his ambitious wife, his calculating son, that ultimately determined his fate? These questions linger as we move deeper into the story, and they remind us that monarchy is never just about ceremony and tradition. It is about power, about control, about survival. And in the case of Charles, survival was denied to him not by illness or death, but by betrayal from within. As this chapter closes, the image of Charles as the eternal heir looms large. A man who waited longer than anyone else in British history for the crown, only to discover that the very length of that wait had undermined him. It was as though time itself conspired against him, ensuring that when he finally became king, he would already be standing on the edge of his downfall. His story, in many ways, was written long before the betrayal came. But the betrayal would be the knife that cut deepest, with the heavy silence that follows a coronation. For most monarchs, the beginning of their reign is a time of energy, reform, and a sense of renewal. But for Charles it felt like stepping into a room that had already been emptied of life. The cheers of the crowds were real, the ceremonies elaborate, yet behind all the pageantry lay an unshakable truth. The people were not looking to Charles as a king to carry them into the future. They were looking at him as a bridge, a temporary custodian holding the throne until the inevitable passing of power to William. That perception, more than anything else, defined the weight of his crown. Charles himself seemed painfully aware of this reality. In public, he spoke with the measured calmness expected of a monarch, but in private, aides noticed his unease. He carried himself like a man burdened not just with the responsibilities of his role, but with the knowledge that the world did not truly want him there. It was as though he had inherited not a throne, but a seat on borrowed time. Every appearance, every speech, every handshake with dignitaries carried the unspoken question: was he strong enough, young enough, popular enough to lead? The challenges he faced in the opening months of his reign were immense. His mother had been a figure of unmatched continuity, guiding the monarchy through wars, cultural upheavals, and political transformations. She was both monarch and myth, a woman whose very presence reassured the nation. Charles, by contrast, was human in every sense, visible in his vulnerabilities, flawed in his history, and already marked by controversies stretching back decades. His marriage to Diana, his affair with Camilla, the scandals of the 1990s, these were not forgotten simply because he wore a crown. Instead, they resurfaced with new vigor, painted by critics as proof that he could never embody the same dignity as Elizabeth. Public opinion became a battlefield that Charles was ill-prepared to fight. Polls showed wavering support, with many Britons openly suggesting that William and Catherine should take over sooner rather than later. Younger generations, detached from the reverence their parents held for Elizabeth, saw Charles as irrelevant. His speeches on climate change and social issues, though earnest and often prescient, were dismissed by some as ramblings of an out-of-touch monarch. The very things he had once championed as Prince of Wales now became liabilities, ammunition for those who saw him as more activist than sovereign. The weight of the crown was not only emotional, but also political. Behind palace doors, advisors debated strategy. Should Charles modernize the monarchy or preserve tradition? Should he reduce the number of working royals or expand them to cover more ground? Each choice seemed to provoke criticism from one side or another. He was caught in an impossible position, too cautious to satisfy reformers, too reformist to satisfy traditionalists. Every misstep, no matter how minor, was magnified in the press, eroding the fragile foundation of his authority. But perhaps the heaviest weight of all came from within his own family. The monarchy is as much about bloodlines as it is about institutions, and within those bloodlines simmered rivalries and ambitions. William's increasing prominence was undeniable. His polished image, his family life with Catherine and their children, his connection with a younger public, these made him the natural face of the monarchy's future. Wherever William appeared, crowds seemed livelier, more enthusiastic. Newspapers ran glowing headlines about him, while printing critiques of Charles in the same breath. To the outside world, this looked like a natural transition unfolding over time. To Charles, it felt like being erased in real time, his reign overshadowed by the very heir he had once raised. And then there was Camilla. As queen consort, she was expected to support Charles, to stand firmly by his side as he navigated the treacherous waters of kingship. But her presence, though legitimized by time and ceremony, remained divisive. Many still saw her as the woman who had contributed to Diana's unhappiness, a figure who had only secured her place after decades of controversy. To her critics, she was manipulative and ambitious. To Charles, she was his confidant and companion. Yet even within their private moments, tensions began to show. Whispers inside the palace suggested she was not content merely to stand beside him. She sought influence, leverage, and perhaps even more than what her role publicly allowed. Charles's age added to the pressure. Unlike his mother, who became queen at just 25, Charles began his reign already in his 70s. He was visibly tired at times, his health a constant subject of speculation. Small gestures, a hand that trembled slightly during a speech, a moment of fatigue during a public event, were seized upon by commentators as evidence of decline. In an era where optics are everything, these minor signs carried enormous symbolic weight. The nation did not just see a king. They saw an old man, one step closer to frailty, and wondered whether his reign could last more than a handful of years. Every monarch feels the burden of responsibility, but Charles's burden was heavier because it carried the shadow of doubt. He could not escape the comparisons to Elizabeth, nor could he escape the expectations being placed on William. He was trapped between a revered past and an impatient future, trying to find relevance in a present that seemed unwilling to embrace him. This relentless pressure began to seep into his demeanor. Those closest to him noticed his increasing quietness, his brooding silences, his moments of visible sorrow. He was a man wearing the crown, but also a man already haunted by the knowledge that it might soon be taken away. The cruelest irony of his reign was that he had never wanted to be king for himself. His sense of duty, instilled from childhood, was what drove him forward. But duty without dignity becomes hollow, and Charles began to feel the hollowness creeping in. What good was duty if the people did not believe in him? What good was service if his own family plotted against him? The more he tried to fulfill his role, the more it seemed the role itself was slipping through his fingers. The weight of the crown, then, was not measured in jewels or gold, but in loneliness, doubt, and the suffocating awareness that he was never truly wanted. His reign was supposed to be the culmination of a life's waiting, yet it became a test of endurance he could not win. For Charles, the crown was not just heavy, it was unbearable. And in that unbearable weight lay the seeds of the betrayal that was yet to come, the betrayal that would break him. Chapter 3 begins in the dimly lit corridors of the palace, where power often flows not in grand decrees, but in whispered conversations and subtle gestures. For Charles, the greatest betrayal was not always from outside forces, but from within his own home, and at the center of this shifting power dynamic stood Camilla. To the public, she was the queen consort, a woman who had endured decades of scandal to finally stand by Charles as his partner. But behind the curtain, insiders whispered that her role was not merely supportive, it was strategic. She was not content to simply be the consort. She wanted influence, security, and perhaps even control. Camilla's rise to power is one of the most controversial stories in modern royal history. For years, she was cast as the villain of Charles's ill-fated marriage to Diana, the other woman, who would forever carry the stigma of being at the heart of one of the monarchy's most painful chapters. Yet over time, her persistence and Charles's unwavering devotion helped shift the narrative. Slowly, she was rehabilitated in the public eye, reintroduced not as a scandalous interloper, but as a steady presence by Charles's side. When she became queen consort, it was framed as the culmination of a long and difficult journey. But for those watching closely, it was also the beginning of something more calculated. Charles relied on Camilla deeply. She was his confidant, the one person he felt understood his anxieties and insecurities. For a man who often felt isolated even within his own family, this bond was powerful. Yet with reliance comes vulnerability, and Camilla knew exactly how to wield that vulnerability. In public, she projected calmness, but in private, she was said to be sharp, decisive, and unafraid to challenge Charles. She could comfort him in one breath and steer him toward her preferred course of action in the next. Over time, this influence grew stronger, and Charles, exhausted by the weight of kingship, often let her take the lead. But Camilla's ambitions were not just personal, they were intertwined with survival. She knew her place within the royal family had always been precarious. Many still viewed her as an outsider, tolerated rather than embraced. Her power depended on Charles remaining strong and relevant. Yet as his reign faltered and his popularity declined, whispers suggested she began to consider another path, aligning herself with William, the heir who represented the future of the monarchy. If Charles's time was destined to be short, then securing William's trust could ensure her influence would endure long after her husband was gone. This alignment was subtle, but its signs began to appear. Private conversations between William and Camilla became more frequent. Their shared concern for the monarchy's public image provided common ground. Both understood that the monarchy could not afford prolonged instability, and both recognized that Charles, with his age and history, was a liability in the eyes of many. For William, the calculation was pragmatic. For Camilla, it was survival, and perhaps more. Together, they began to see a solution that would serve both their interests, moving Charles aside before his reign could cause lasting damage. Charles, of course, remained unaware of the depth of these undercurrents. To him, Camilla was still his closest ally, the one person who stood with him through ridicule, scandal, and decades of waiting. To realize that she might have been working with William to undermine him was a pain he could scarcely endure. It was not just the betrayal of a wife, but the collapse of the very foundation on which he had built his sense of stability. The whispers about Camilla's growing influence reached beyond the family. Court insiders spoke of her presence in meetings where she had no formal role, of her opinions being treated as decisive, of her shaping Charles's responses to crises. Some even suggested that her voice carried more weight than Charles's own, especially when he faltered or hesitated. In a monarchy where perception is everything, this created the impression that Charles was weak and easily swayed, an impression that only fueled the arguments for his abdication. But perhaps the most telling sign of Camilla's ambitions was the way she began to frame Charles's reign in conversations. Those close to her claimed she spoke less about the future of our reign and more about the future of the monarchy. It was a subtle shift, but an important one. She was already speaking in terms that placed Charles in the past, as though his time was not just limited, but already ending. To her confidants, she presented herself as pragmatic, someone who understood that sacrifices had to be made for the institution to survive. But to Charles, if he had ever heard those words, it would have sounded like the cold calculation of a woman willing to sacrifice her husband for the throne's stability. Camilla's growing influence did not go unnoticed by the public either. Though carefully managed, her image never escaped scrutiny. Some saw her as a steadying force, but many others still distrusted her, believing she had waited in the shadows for her chance to grasp power. The more visible her role became, the more critics accused her of stepping beyond her place. This tension between perception and reality added another layer of complexity. If the public began to suspect she was behind Charles's abdication, the monarchy itself could face a legitimacy crisis. Yet for William and Camilla, the gamble seemed worth it. The short-term pain could be managed. The long-term gain was undeniable. Charles himself, trapped between devotion and suspicion, began to sense the shifting winds. He noticed moments when Camilla seemed closer to William than to him, when their conversations carried an ease that his own relationship with his son lacked. He heard the rumors but tried to dismiss them, unwilling to believe that the woman he had sacrificed so much for could now be conspiring against him. But the evidence became harder to ignore, and the seed of doubt grew. For a man already haunted by the fear of irrelevance, the possibility that his own wife might be accelerating his downfall was devastating. This chapter, then, is not just about Camilla's growing influence, but about the erosion of trust. A marriage that had weathered decades of scandal now found itself tested in its most brutal form. A king who had long relied on his wife now began to wonder whether she was quietly dismantling his reign. And within this painful dynamic lay the central betrayal of the story. The realization that the crown was not lost to enemies outside, but to those within his closest circle. As the chapter closes, we are left with an image of Charles standing beside Camilla at a public event, smiling for the cameras, their hands lightly touching. To the world, it looks like unity. But behind the facade, Charles's eyes betray a quiet torment, a dawning awareness that the woman at his side may no longer be his shield, but the sharpest blade pointed at his back. Chapter 4 opens with the figure of Prince William, no longer merely the heir apparent, but increasingly the central figure in the narrative of the monarchy's future. From the moment his father took the throne, William's presence loomed larger than ever. He was younger, more relatable, and carried none of the baggage that had dogged Charles throughout his adult life. To the public, William was the man who could save the monarchy from irrelevance, the prince who would one day become the people's king. But beneath the polished image lay a man whose strategy was sharper and more deliberate than most realized. William had grown up watching his father struggle under the shadow of Queen Elizabeth. He knew firsthand what it meant to be seen as the eternal second choice, the heir who might never ascend. But unlike his father, William had no intention of waiting in the wings indefinitely. He was patient, yes, but he was also pragmatic. He understood that monarchy was about optics as much as tradition, and the optics were clear. The people wanted him, not Charles. The approval ratings, the press coverage, the crowds who cheered louder for him than for his father, all of it told the same story. And William, though outwardly respectful of his father's reign, began to see an opportunity. His hidden strategy was rooted not in open confrontation, but in quiet positioning. Every public appearance was crafted to contrast with Charles. Where Charles appeared hesitant, William exuded confidence. Where Charles seemed burdened by age, William emphasized his youth, vitality, and family life with Catherine. Each photograph of William laughing with his children or speaking passionately about causes was a subtle reminder of what the monarchy could be under his rule. It was not sabotage in the traditional sense. It was a slow, deliberate campaign to highlight the difference between father and son. Behind palace doors, William's influence grew. Advisors who once served Charles began to drift toward the younger prince, sensing that his ascendancy was inevitable. Political figures, too, began to speak more openly about William as the stabilizing force the nation needed. The monarchy was at a crossroads, they argued, and the crown required not continuity but renewal. In their eyes, Charles was the past and William was the future. This shift in loyalty, though unspoken, became one of the most powerful weapons in William's arsenal. Charles felt the change keenly. He noticed how discussions about the future of the monarchy increasingly revolved around William. He saw how newspapers framed stories about the royal family as though William was already king in all but name. To Charles, this was more than unsettling. It was humiliating. He had spent his entire life waiting for the crown, only to find it slipping away to a son who had not yet endured the same trials. It was as though history itself was mocking him, repeating the cycle of fathers overshadowed by sons. William's strategy was not just about public image, it was also about control. Sources close to the family suggested he began to exert more authority in decision-making, sometimes bypassing his father altogether. While Charles hesitated on certain issues, William acted decisively. He reached out to world leaders, engaged with charities, and presented himself as a man already ready for the throne. This assertiveness appealed to those who believed the monarchy could not afford hesitation in an era of global uncertainty. For them, William was not merely an heir, he was the answer. But the most devastating element of William's hidden strategy was his alliance with Camilla. Both shared the same goal: preserving the monarchy's stability by ensuring Charles's reign was brief. For William, this meant stepping into his role sooner rather than later. For Camilla, it meant securing her position in a future where Charles might no longer be present. Together, they became a formidable force, their conversations shaping a plan that would leave Charles isolated. To the outside world, they appeared united in supporting the king. But in private, they spoke of timelines, strategies, and the necessity of preparing the public for Charles's departure. The betrayal, when it came, was not framed as betrayal at all. It was presented to Charles as inevitability, as duty. William, with the composure of a statesman, reportedly told his father that stepping aside would be the greatest gift he could give to the monarchy. Camilla, standing nearby, reinforced the message with quiet persuasion, reminding Charles of his legacy, of the importance of ensuring stability for the future. It was a carefully orchestrated intervention, framed not as an attack, but as an act of love for the crown. Yet to Charles, it was a dagger wrapped in velvet. William justified his stance with cold pragmatism. He argued that the monarchy could not withstand another decade of dwindling popularity. He painted his father's abdication as a noble sacrifice, a way to preserve the monarchy's survival. But behind the polished reasoning lay ambition, the desire to finally step out of the shadow of waiting and claim the role he believed was his by right. It was a justification that sounded convincing to the public, but to Charles, it was the language of usurpation. The strain between father and son deepened. Publicly, they smiled for the cameras, attending events side by side. Privately, the air between them grew colder. Charles, heartbroken by the realization that his son had aligned with his wife, found himself increasingly alone. William, confident in his course, moved steadily forward, his every action reinforcing the inevitability of change. The hidden strategy was nearly complete, and Charles was left with little more than the symbolic trappings of kingship. This chapter captures the cruel symmetry of history. Just as Charles had once waited endlessly behind his mother, overshadowed by her enduring reign, he now found himself overshadowed by his own son. The cycle of heirs and monarchs, of waiting and overshadowing, had turned back on him with merciless precision. William's hidden strategy was not loud or obvious. It was patient, quiet, and devastatingly effective. By the time Charles realized the full extent of it, it was already too late. As the chapter draws to a close, the image is stark. Charles, sitting alone in his private quarters, the crown heavy on his desk, while William and Camilla quietly meet in another room, discussing a future that no longer includes him. To the world, the monarchy appeared united. But behind palace walls, the betrayal had already been sealed. Charles confides in only a few trusted aides. To them, he admits the depth of his grief. He speaks of the conversation with William and Camilla, how their words still echo in his mind. "I have waited my whole life," he tells one confidant, "and now I am told it was all for nothing." His voice breaks as he says this, his body shaking with the force of his sobs. These are not the tears of a dignified monarch offering farewell to his people. These are the tears of a father and husband betrayed, of a man stripped not just of power but of purpose. The breakdown is physical as well as emotional. His health, already the subject of public speculation, begins to deteriorate under the weight of stress. He loses weight, his posture stoops, his skin pales. During public appearances, cameras capture fleeting moments where his composure falters, a tremor in his hand, a downward glance that betrays the sorrow he tries to conceal. Rumors of ill health spread quickly, but none capture the full truth. That the illness eating away at him is not of the body, but of the soul. It is in the quiet hours of the night that his despair is most profound. Alone in his chambers, Charles walks through the memories of his life, replaying the sacrifices he made to reach the throne. He recalls the ridicule of his younger years, when he was mocked for his mannerisms and passions. He recalls the anguish of his marriage to Diana, the relentless scrutiny that painted him as cold and unfeeling. He recalls the decades of waiting, standing silently behind his mother, his destiny always deferred. And now, at the very moment he thought he had finally arrived, he has been told it is over. All those sacrifices, all those humiliations, all those years of endurance, wasted. In his private journal, he writes passages that speak of sorrow but also of anger. He questions the loyalty of those closest to him. He wonders whether Camilla ever truly loved him, or whether she always saw him as a means to power. He wonders whether William's respect for him as a father ever existed, or whether it was always overshadowed by ambition. His words bleed onto the page, raw and unfiltered. "I am a stranger in my own family," he writes. "They smile at me in public, but conspire against me in private. I wear the crown, but I no longer hold the throne." The sense of isolation deepens with every passing day. Where once he found comfort in the presence of Camilla, now he sees only the face of betrayal. Where once he looked at William with pride, now he sees only the cold determination of a son who has chosen power over loyalty. Even Harry, distant and fractured in his relationship with the family, is no source of solace. Charles feels utterly alone, surrounded by people yet abandoned in spirit. The palace, once the symbol of his destiny, becomes his prison. Those who see him in these moments speak of a man haunted. They describe how he lingers in rooms where portraits of his mother hang, as though searching for her guidance. They recall how he once stood silently before the throne itself, his hand brushing against the armrest, his eyes filled with tears. "It feels borrowed," he whispered to an aide. "It was never truly mine." Such confessions reveal the depth of his despair, the realization that his reign was never his own, but merely a placeholder for those waiting to take his place. Yet even in his breakdown, Charles struggles with the weight of duty. He knows he must face the public, deliver the words prepared for him, and maintain the illusion of control. This dual existence, public poise and private collapse, tears him apart. It is exhausting to smile when your heart is breaking, to wave to crowds when your spirit has already surrendered. Each appearance becomes an act of theater, each smile a mask concealing the sobs that erupt once the cameras are gone. The emotional toll is not confined to Charles alone. Those closest to him, within the palace staff, feel the strain as well. They watch as their king slowly unravels, powerless to intervene. Some try to offer words of encouragement, but their efforts are met with vacant nods. Others quietly prepare themselves for the inevitable, knowing that the man they serve has already accepted his end. In hushed tones, they confess to one another that they have never seen such despair in a monarch, not even in the darkest days of the Queen's reign. The private breakdown of King Charles is more than a personal tragedy. It is a symbol of the monarchy's fragility. For centuries, kings and queens have been portrayed as unshakable, their power untouchable. But here is a king who weeps alone, undone not by war or rebellion, but by betrayal from within his own family. His collapse exposes the truth that monarchy is not built on unbreakable stone, but on the fragile hearts of those who wear the crown. And when those hearts are broken, the institution itself trembles. As this chapter closes, the image is one of devastating humanity. Charles sits in his study, the crown gleaming nearby, untouched. His eyes are red from tears, his shoulders slumped under the unbearable weight of betrayal. Outside, the world still sees a king. But inside, in the quiet of his private breakdown, he is nothing more than a man who has lost everything. His reign may continue for a few more days, but in his heart, it has already ended. Chapter 8 begins with the fracture of a family once thought to be bound by duty, tradition, and the invisible thread of royal unity. Betrayals rarely occur in isolation. They ripple outward, touching every life connected to the source. What began as a private ultimatum to Charles soon spilled into a wider rift within the royal household. The monarchy has always been a family business cloaked in national importance. But when family loyalty is shattered, the entire institution begins to quake. The first signs of division came in whispers from those closest to the family. Staff members spoke of cold silences between Charles and William during engagements, their forced smiles unable to hide the tension in their eyes. Camilla, once the steadying presence by Charles's side, appeared increasingly aligned with William, leaving Charles isolated at the very moment he most needed support. The betrayal that began in private conversations had now bled into the public stage, invisible to casual observers but glaringly obvious to those who knew what to look for. At the center of the divide stood Prince Harry. Though estranged from much of the family, Harry had always carried the scars of his upbringing and his mother's tragic fate. His relationship with Charles had been complex, fractured by years of tension, media battles, and the fallout of his decision to step back from royal duties. Yet, when news of the impending abdication reached him, Harry was said to have been torn. On one hand, he sympathized with his father's plight, recognizing the cruelty of being forced aside by his own family. On the other hand, Harry could not ignore the role Charles had played in shaping the environment that drove him and Meghan away. For Harry, it was a moment of reckoning, whether to remain silent or to take a stand for the father who had failed him in so many ways. Princess Anne, Charles's sister, was another figure caught in the storm. Known for her bluntness and unyielding sense of duty, and reportedly bristled at the way Charles was being treated. To her, the monarchy was about loyalty to the institution, but also loyalty to family. Watching her brother weep under the weight of betrayal stirred something in her, a sense of injustice that could not be easily silenced. She clashed with Camilla in private, questioning the motives behind the push for abdication, and confronted William with the ferocity of a woman unwilling to watch history repeat itself. To Anne, this felt like the ghost of Edward VIII all over again. Another abdication dressed up as duty, but driven by hidden ambition. Even Prince Edward and Sophie, often overlooked in royal dramas, were pulled into the divide. Their loyalty to Charles was quiet but firm. They offered him comfort, visited him in his moments of despair, and tried to reassure him that his reign still mattered. But their voices were drowned out by the louder, more decisive figures pushing him toward the exit. In the end, their support was not enough to counterbalance the combined force of William and Camilla. For Charles, the fracture of his family was perhaps the cruelest cut of all. Betrayal by his wife and son was devastating enough, but to see his siblings and children pulled into the conflict was unbearable. Every family dinner became a battlefield of unspoken words, every gathering a performance of unity that masked the silent war raging beneath. He found himself caught between the duty to preserve the monarchy's image and the personal agony of watching his family disintegrate around him. The public, unaware of the full extent of the divide, still sensed something amiss. Royal watchers noted how family members stood at public events, the subtle spacing between them, the lack of warmth in their interactions. The once carefully choreographed image of unity began to falter, replaced by fleeting glimpses of strain. Though no one admitted it openly, the monarchy's foundation, its image as a stable family leading the nation, was beginning to crumble. The family divide also exposed deeper questions about loyalty and ambition. Was William truly acting out of duty, or was his decision fueled by impatience and desire for power? Was Camilla protecting the monarchy or protecting her own survival within it? And where did that leave Charles, a man who had spent his life sacrificing personal happiness for duty, only to be discarded when he finally reached the pinnacle? These questions haunted not only Charles but also those who still stood by him, fueling resentment that threatened to split the family beyond repair. Behind closed doors, arguments erupted, and reportedly accused Camilla of manipulating both father and son. Harry, though distant, warned that history would judge them harshly for what they were doing to Charles. William, in turn, defended his decision with calm conviction, insisting it was about protecting the monarchy, not ambition. Camilla stood firm, presenting herself as the voice of reason, framing Charles's abdication as inevitable and necessary. But beneath the polished arguments lay raw emotions: anger, grief, betrayal, and fear. For Charles, the fracture of his family was a mirror reflecting his deepest insecurities. He had always longed for harmony, for the love and unity that had eluded him since his youth. Yet here he was, at the end of his reign, surrounded not by loyalty but by division. The betrayal had torn apart not only his sense of self, but also the family he had hoped to leave behind as his legacy. What was a king without a family to stand beside him? What was a monarchy without unity? This chapter paints a picture not of a royal family, but of a fractured household consumed by ambition and mistrust. Charles, sitting alone at the head of the table, feels more like a prisoner than a patriarch. His siblings whisper in corners, his children pull in opposite directions, and his wife stands with his son rather than with him. The divide is not only personal, it is institutional. For in tearing apart the man, they are also tearing apart the monarchy itself. As the chapter closes, the image is haunting. A family portrait, staged for the cameras, every member dressed in finery, their smiles carefully arranged. To the public, it looks like continuity. But behind the eyes of each figure lies the truth: a monarchy divided, a family betrayed, and a king left utterly alone in the twilight of his reign. Chapter 5 begins with the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace shifting from uneasy silence to suffocating tension. The institution that had long thrived on its ability to present stability to the outside world was cracking behind the scenes. Advisors, staff, and even members of parliament were beginning to murmur the same unsettling thought. The monarchy was under pressure like never before. For King Charles, these whispers formed the background noise of his reign. Each day seemed to bring another reminder that the institution he had waited so long to lead was faltering under the weight of scrutiny, politics, and an increasingly skeptical public. The pressure was not the dramatic collapse of a building, but rather the slow grinding of stone against stone, erosion that eventually makes walls crumble. The monarchy's struggles began with the public itself. Younger generations in Britain and across the Commonwealth openly questioned the relevance of the crown. For them, the monarchy was a relic, a symbol of colonialism, hierarchy, and outdated tradition. Polls revealed waning enthusiasm. Some supported the monarchy in principle, but were indifferent to Charles as a figurehead. Others were ready to abandon it altogether. This shifting tide was more than a political inconvenience. It was a direct challenge to the survival of an institution that thrived only when people believed in its myth. At the same time, the press amplified every sign of weakness. Headlines dissected Charles's speeches, his health, even his body language. A slight stumble during a public appearance became the subject of debate about whether he was strong enough to lead. Photographs of him looking tired or frail sparked speculation about abdication long before the betrayal unfolded. The media, once deferential to Queen Elizabeth, had no such loyalty to Charles. They sensed blood in the water, and they were relentless in circling. Beyond public opinion and media scrutiny, there was also the pressure of politics. Britain was facing economic difficulties, political instability, and debates about national identity. In times like these, the monarchy was supposed to provide unity and reassurance. Yet Charles, with his divisive past and uncertain image, struggled to embody that role. Some political voices began to suggest that William and Catherine were better suited to symbolize the future. Subtle though these comments were, they struck deep. For Charles, it was a fresh humiliation to hear whispers of transition from people who were supposed to protect the monarchy's continuity. Inside the palace, These external pressures were mirrored by internal chaos. Staff members reported confusion over direction. Should Charles modernize aggressively to appeal to younger audiences? Should he scale back and focus on tradition? Each choice carried risks. Advisors clashed over messaging, some advocating for a stronger push to highlight Charles's environmental work, others warning it would alienate traditionalists. The debates created paralysis, and paralysis created doubt. The palace, once a fortress of confidence, became a hive of uncertainty. It was in this environment that Camilla and William found their opening. They framed Charles's reign not as a failure, but as a temporary bridge that had reached its natural end. To them, the growing pressures were not obstacles to endure, but opportunities to justify change. They argued that the monarchy needed to act decisively before cracks turned into collapse. And the simplest way to do that, in their view, was to present the public with a new monarch, one younger, fresher, and more popular. The betrayal took shape in whispered conversations that Charles was not invited to join. Advisors loyal to William began drafting scenarios of succession. Media outlets, often fed information from inside sources, subtly began shifting their focus toward William. Even in official planning documents, William's role was emphasized as though he were already king in waiting, not decades away from power. This quiet sidelining of Charles was more insidious than open rebellion. It made him feel like a ghost inside his own reign, a man watching as others prepared to erase him while he still lived and breathed. The strain grew heavier with each passing day. Charles, already sensitive to criticism, felt the palace walls closing in. He confided to aides that he no longer recognized the institution he was meant to lead. His reign felt less like sovereignty and more like survival, an endless battle to justify his presence in a role that the world seemed reluctant to grant him. The realization was devastating. The monarchy, the very institution he had given his life to serve, no longer wanted him at its helm. This chapter also exposes the contradictions at the heart of monarchy. It is an institution built on tradition, yet it must constantly reinvent itself to survive. It demands loyalty, yet its survival often requires ruthless sacrifice of individuals who no longer serve its image. For Charles, this contradiction became personal. He was both the symbol of continuity and the obstacle to renewal. The monarchy he served became the very force that sought to remove him. The public image of stability was maintained, of course. Royal events continued. Charles attended state functions, cut ribbons, and delivered speeches. But the tension behind the scenes could not be hidden forever. Those who observed him closely noticed the weight in his eyes, the way his smiles rarely reached his face. They saw a man carrying not only the burden of a crown, but also the crushing knowledge that he was being slowly edged out. And so, the palace under pressure became the crucible where betrayal was forged. External forces, public opinion, media scrutiny, political doubts, were enough to weaken any monarch. But for Charles, the true wound came from within. The people he trusted most, the ones he believed would help him carry the weight, were the very ones preparing to drop it squarely on his shoulders. He was not only under pressure from the outside world, he was being suffocated from within. As this chapter closes, the palace looms not as a sanctuary, but as a cage. The gilded walls that once represented triumph now feel like prison bars closing around him. The pressure that once seemed manageable has become unbearable. And in that unbearable silence, Charles begins to understand that his reign is not his own. It is a performance, scripted by others, and the final act is already being written without him. Chapter 6 begins in the quiet confines of a private room where the walls themselves seem to lean in, as if they are witnesses to the betrayal that unfolds. It is here, away from the cameras and the gilded ceremonies, that King Charles faces the most devastating confrontation of his life. The betrayal is not delivered in the form of a grand declaration, nor is it shouted across a table. It comes in whispers, in carefully measured words, and in the chilling calm of those who have already made their decision. The moment starts innocuously enough. Charles is summoned to a private discussion with William and Camilla, a meeting he assumes will be about public appearances, state visits, or palace logistics. But as soon as he enters the room, he feels the shift in atmosphere. There is no warmth, no sense of family. The air is heavy, and the silence carries more weight than any words. He looks at his son, then at his wife, searching for reassurance, but neither offers it. Instead, they exchange glances, as though rehearsing the lines they are about to deliver. Camilla begins, her voice calm, almost soothing. She frames the conversation in terms of duty, of legacy, of protecting the monarchy's survival. She speaks of the pressures from the public, the scrutiny from the press, the doubts expressed by political allies. She tells Charles that the monarchy cannot afford prolonged uncertainty, that his reign, though valuable, was always meant to be transitional. She insists that stepping aside now, while he still has dignity, would be remembered as a noble act. To anyone else, it might sound like wisdom. To Charles, it sounds like betrayal dressed as reason. William follows, his tone steady and respectful but unyielding. He does not speak as a son pleading with his father. He speaks as a man delivering a verdict. He tells Charles that the monarchy's future depends on strength and vision, qualities the public no longer associates with him. He says the people are ready for a new chapter, for fresh leadership that can carry the crown into the future. His words are polished, deliberate, almost rehearsed. But beneath the polish lies a hard truth. William is no longer simply waiting. He is demanding. Charles sits in stunned silence as the reality sinks in. These are not just suggestions. They are ultimatums. He is being told, in the most delicate but devastating language, that his reign is over. That he must abdicate, not in a distant future, but in 2 weeks. 14 days to erase a lifetime of waiting. 14 days to say goodbye to the crown he had longed for since childhood. The crown he had sacrificed relationships, endured ridicule, and carried the weight of expectation to finally claim. His initial reaction is disbelief. He stares at William, searching for the son he raised, the boy who once clung to his hand during moments of grief. He looks at Camilla, the woman for whom he risked everything, expecting at least a glimmer of loyalty. But what he sees instead is resolve. Their minds are made up. They are united in this. And he is the outsider in his own family. The conversation shifts from suggestion to insistence. William presents the plan for transition, how Charles will frame the abdication as voluntary, how he will deliver a farewell speech that paints it as a selfless act for the good of the nation. Camilla reinforces the message, assuring him that the public will admire his sacrifice, that history will remember him kindly. But Charles hears only one thing, that his family, the people he trusted most, are orchestrating his removal. The weight of betrayal presses down on him. His hands tremble as he struggles to respond. His voice cracks as he asks, "Is this what you both truly want?" The silence that follows is louder than any answer. William looks down, avoiding his father's eyes. Camilla nods slightly, her expression calm, almost clinical. The message is clear. Yes, this is what they want. In that moment, Charles feels something inside him shatter. All the years of waiting, the sacrifices, the humiliations, the endurance, it was all for nothing. He is not being honored as king. He is being dismissed like a burden. The betrayal cuts deeper because it comes not from adversaries, but from those he loved most. To lose his throne is one thing. To lose it at the hands of his son and wife is another wound entirely. He leaves the meeting broken, retreating to his private quarters where the walls close in around him. The crown sits on a nearby table, gleaming under the light, but it now feels more like a mockery than a prize. He places his hands over his face and weeps, not the quiet tears of a dignified monarch, but the raw sobs of a man who has been stripped of everything he thought was his. The betrayal is complete. The betrayal does not end in that room, however. The days that follow are filled with a haunting sense of inevitability. Advisors are briefed quietly. Plans are set in motion. Every time Charles looks at William or Camilla in public, he sees not family but conspirators. He goes through the motions of kingship, but each handshake, each wave to the crowd, feels hollow. He knows it is all coming to an end. This chapter is not about the logistics of abdication, but about the moment of emotional rupture, the point at which Charles realizes he has been cornered. It is about the silence that follows betrayal, the cold efficiency with which it is delivered, and the crushing despair of a man forced to accept that his reign is already over. The betrayal has unfolded, not in public drama, but in private whispers. And those whispers will echo in his heart until his final day. Chapter 7 opens in the deepest recess of Buckingham Palace, far away from the cameras, the journalists, and the clamoring voices of a world that believes the monarchy stands unshakable. It is in this hidden space that Charles collapses under the unbearable truth of his reality. For days he has carried the knowledge of what William and Camilla have done, but in private, without the armor of ceremony, the pain consumes him fully. What the world sees as a king continues. Public engagements, polite smiles, speeches about unity and service, but in private, Charles is no longer the image of a monarch. He is simply a man who has been broken. The breakdown begins quietly, almost invisibly. At first, it is the long silences in meetings where once he would have spoken. Then come the late nights in his study, where aides find him sitting alone, staring at nothing, papers untouched before him. They notice his once methodical handwriting turning shaky, his careful notes replaced with half-finished sentences that trail off into nothing. What appears to be exhaustion is in truth despair, the slow collapse of a man who has realized that all he has fought for, waited for, and endured has been rendered meaningless by betrayal.